Hi everybody, this is Hector. I'm a designer at Google, I'm a failed engineer and a failed artist, but a designer at heart. I'm here with a friend of mine, Cynthia, Dr. Cynthia. She is a professor at the MIT Media Lab and she directs the Personal Robot Group.
It's great to be here, Hector. I'm curious then, so like in my work, for instance, as we're designing robots and so forth, we do a lot of participatory design, a lot of human-centered design. Now there's kind of these new frameworks around design justice. So like, how do you have these diverse voices really participate in the early design process from the get-go and even think about different roles that they can play throughout the whole design process until you actually have your product or artifact or the thing that you actually want to have people use and enjoy. So I'm curious for you in your work, like within your process, how do you make room for that empathy, and particularly for your empathy with your stakeholders? Like how do you, in terms of just practice, how do you do that?
No, that's a very good question. I think that starts in the, let's say in the highest level, the process of creating something new starts by capturing insights, like asking around users, like what is their problem, right? Sadly, many times I found my partners just doing something because they can, because they're so good and they build, versus starting with the first, like what is the problem, right? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Why do we need another bicycle? Oh, because the other bicycle is not as fast as now, right? People usually don't start with that at all levels of the organization. Then when we start prototyping, okay, this will be a very good idea, we start prototyping it and then bring it back to people, real people, and say, yeah, that works. Oh no, that actually makes my problem even worse because it's yet another app that I need to download or whatever, right? Then as we go back, continue going in the process of, okay, this is solving a real problem, this prototype kind of makes sense, we have the technical capacity to build it, it's viable for the business because whatever we're measuring, we present it to stakeholders and they forget usually that they're people too. So, or sometimes they also have this, they think they are the users, which is also not true. And so it's often about like the process should guide them. It's like, this is a problem we're trying to solve. You're not the user. And here are the trade-offs, right? I think that I like very much the notion of trade-offs lately because it makes things very real. Because it allows you to say, we can ship this now with this quality, or we can ship this later with more quality. What do you want? And I always assume that they know more than I do because they have a different vantage point. And that is very helpful because then sometimes I notice that in my teams, when you have more junior designers and they don't understand why we shipped something, right? And say, oh no, it was not ready. But they don't see what the stakeholders are often seeing because maybe this launch will unlock a new way to understand people and so on. So it's usually through that. And more through the years, I noticed that our stakeholders are developing that sensitivity, right? That sensitivity towards quality, towards not cookie cutter approach, towards more empathic or a more empathic approach towards product development, which is nice. I think we're not there yet, but it's nice because as in the tech industry, the majority of people are very feasibility driven. People love to build things because that's what they train off, right? Then we have very little people around viable, like, is this good for the business? And then very, very few people on the desirable aspect, which people want to use it, right? And I think it's also how schools and other industries have evolved, right? Like we're seeing this evolution of humanities, if you will, to become much of a formal practice that's influencing how we build things. And how we build things at scale is much more important. And I have a question for you in terms of how do you overcome these disappointments or these challenges when the people that are seeing your work don't get it, or they measure it in terms of, because it's usually long-term, like developing a relationship with somebody else takes years. And when they're able to criticize your work based on the short term. And I would love to hear from you, like, how do you deal with that, if you've dealt with that before?
I mean, I've dealt with that my entire career, I would say. So, I think whenever, what do they say? You can always tell the pioneers because they have all the arrows in their backs, right?
Exactly.
I have a lot of arrows. I got a lot of arrows in my back. It's a combination of showing an experience that's so fundamentally different and, and visceral and provocative that it gets people's attention. So some of it is very much creating something that gets people to go, whoa, I had never even thought about something. In the case of robots, I hadn't even thought about robots that could interact and emote with people in this way, and seeing people reciprocate with emotion and empathy towards the robot. It's like that was like the first moment where I got people's attention. I guess that's what I'm saying. It was provocative. I got people's attention. Then you want to be able to show, like, why does that matter, right? So not only can you begin to create this new kind of experience, but what is the value of that? Why does that matter? And so we started looking at, a number of different applications where this, this social emotional experience and relationship actually was really important. And, we often would go to the human literature, the human psychology literature. So things like emotional support, social support, engagement. What are the big challenges we face in society where we know that nature of experience is really important for people to be successful? So we started to look at domains like early childhood learning. We started looking at domains like emotional resilience. And when we're trying to now think about this experience, but now applied to a really important outcome, like reduction in getting depressed or so forth, things like that, or improving your readiness for kindergarten. So some tangible, objectively important outcome. Then we start to do systematic studies, often in the form of randomized controlled trials, right? So a very scientific, rigorous way to then show if you create a technology with these properties able to deliver this experience, for instance, versus one that doesn't, in a controlled way, same content, same curriculum, whatever it is, but just lacks these extra human experience features. How do people do, right? So the outcome is, which is better for people? And how can you actually measure that? So that's basically, that's the strategy that in academic research we often take, which is that we show in a very rigorous scientific way from an experiential standpoint, interestingly, that when you include these properties or these features in the artifact, lo and behold, people learn better, they're more, they report better improved mood, they're more resilient to stress, So in my work, that's how I do it. Now, in the world of science, we're still talking about, these are, by Google standards, these are small user studies. These are like hundreds of people, right? The challenge then is to be able to grow and scale that to show it for many, many, many more people. And I think this is where this relationship between, I think, academia and industry research and then ultimately kind of industry, productization is important, but I think we don't do it really well yet. Where I would like to see much more collaboration and interplay. So for instance, I feel like we would talk about the ethical or responsible design of these technologies, right? People in academia, we have the ability and the time and the interest to really invest a lot into those questions, right? And to come up with the right kinds of principles or guidelines that maybe within an industrial setting, you don't have the same motivation or incentives or ability to do that. So we can potentially light the way in a way that if we could engage with industry in a more, deeper way, we could be helping to kind of make sure that we don't have the kind of missteps that we're starting to see when technology is having unintended consequences on people's lives, right?
Totally.
So that's one area where I'd like to see much richer, much deeper collaboration between academia and research.
No, that makes sense.
And
this
industry,
is a very this behavior of people looking inwards, and by people meaning groups or tribes, or academia looking to academia and industry looking to industry, is very common. And I often see that it requires maybe pioneers, that's why you have all these arrows that you don't see in the shot, but they're right there. It's like requires to break those silos and reach out, right? Because from the silo perspective, it's very inefficient. Or like you said, there's no value in reaching out because it's not understood, right? So it has to be a lot of entertaining, or what if this, right? What if we approach this in the other way and see that actually the silo next to you might be complementary, it's not a threat, or it's not a waste of your time. And I see that it's also very related to how we engage with each other as people, right? We have this very, usually we have it at Google, we went through this phase of we building a lot of features to building user journeys. It were many of our developers were scratching their head around like, why would people use the products in that way? We didn't build them in that way. It's more like we were trying to ship sometimes our org chart and expect our users or people to adapt to those. I'm like, no, people just like to do what they do every day, and they walk across all these different features or products or devices. And that's why they're so unhappy, because their things don't work between those silos, right? And I think it's a nature of incentives, as you mentioned, and capacity of entertaining. We might be able to work better together if we're all in this together. So one of my biggest disappointments with the current state of technology is how much time it takes to make one thing work with the other, right? There's a waste of our time fiddling with all of this. So I'm really looking forward for when things become much easier to develop across all of these different things, that it can work in one of your robots, to my TV, to my watch, and it's just, we think more like that, right? I think that will be very nice.
So as a designer, I'm curious, because we talk a lot about, the features and then user journeys. So do you feel there's a dichotomy, or maybe it's an artificial dichotomy, but this question of what the technology does, the features, the functions, how you use it, versus the experience of the technology, how a user engages with it, like you're saying, what the empathy or emotion evoked is. How much do you find, as you design a product, is spent on usability and features and things like that versus this deeper human experience aspect of it?
Oh, I love how you frame that question, because I absolutely agree with that dichotomy. And sadly, probably you already know the answer, the majority of our energy is spent on that technology aspect and on the experience of that technology. And I don't think it's just only in the tech industry, but as a whole, I feel like they most often, and this is also, I blame a little bit the movies and science fiction, they portray technology as the protagonist. They portray technology as these beeps, sounds, lasers, things, that they just take a very big role in someone's life. And I couldn't disagree more with that. I do believe that technology needs to be, the way I usually refer to it, is to be tepid, like to be very tepid and to be in the background. And the warmth of the experience comes from people to people, right? An ideal situation is when you talk with someone else remotely, all these wires, something goes away, and it's just you and I, and our gestures, and our quirks, and our different ways to approach life. That creates the warmth. And I do believe that space, when we build products, is often not considered or forgotten because we're ready to move to the next thing, right? And also it's difficult. Imagine, how do you market? Technology you don't see it, but it's there making you better. You don't even know, right? So that's a thing that it's at head with the way we're building products, not just digital products, but products for the different decades that we're building. Also is, I think when you take away technology, you take away the bricks in front of you or the TVs, it's honestly a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary because I think that we're not trained to be with other people just like that. I think that's a little bit that we have to come to grips and say, okay, fine, I'm gonna talk with this person in front of me, that's it, there's no more. And technology is just aiding and mediating noise or distractions, but it's out there and it's in my benefit of me as a person versus the benefit of technology by itself. So it's a great dichotomy. How do you experience it?
How do I experience? So, you know, in my work now, I've kind of reframed the fundamental question from, in contrast to a lot of kind of, I would say, where my field is, where again, a lot of the focus is, I want to build an AI or a robot that can do some task, like this very concrete task, and I've, over the recent couple of years, have started to flip that question to ask, can AI help us to flourish? Mm-hmm. What if we ask that question? So not how can AI help me do X, but can AI actually help me to flourish, help me to thrive, help me to be more socially connected to the people I love, to help me to feel like I can be successful in my achievement. That's an important part of flourishing, to be healthier, right? To be, to have positive emotional moments in my life, right? We know all of these things are important to help people to flourish. We who design these kinds of technologies, we often don't ask that question, right? And when you start to ask that question, you start to realize, again, that the how is also important, that the experience is important. So, in my work, the technologies do engage as a social other. That's the mental model. Like you've talked about, kind of the invisible technology, maybe that's kind of, it's not quite a tool. It's almost kind of maybe like a prosthetic, and that's kind of like part of you, but it's not like this thing that's beeping and buzzing at you, right? So I think there's these kind of fundamental different mental models and relationships we can have with technology. So in my particular one, it's the social, emotional, supportive, empathetic other, right? Helpful companion model of technology. And so in many ways, I design technologies to basically be like that, to be this empathetic, supportive other, because typically when we are challenged, when we're feeling vulnerable, it's one thing to feel like I got information and stuff like that at my fingertips, but it's very different to feel like I've got someone else in my corner who's got my back, who's really there to help me and to motivate me and to be there, right? That's what I think so many people need from each other. And so my question as I design these technologies is, how can you create technologies that enhance, again, the ability of our human support, our human care networks to operate, to be stronger amongst each other, but where the technology is also kind of part of that social network. And so I guess that's kind of the provocative part. It's there to help enhance the human connections, but it's also there as part of that, that social network. I mean, to your point, the more that we can design technologies that enhance and support the human connection, it is really, really important. I mean, I think so many of us can look to various technologies and platforms and ask the really, critical question of, has this somehow marginalized our human connection? Right now we're experiencing this time of extreme polarization, right, and conversation. And, I have, teenagers that, their social interaction with friends is often, virtual through playing video games, things like that. And, it's just, I think we want to come up with, these balanced diets of how to engage each other in meaningful, empathetic, respectful, and just being curious and caring, right? Like being authentically interested in other people. I think technology that helps us do that, I think is particularly important right now.